The storm was loud, but what she heard through the thunder would change everything. Ella Monroe sat in her room, perched on the edge of her bed, her small hands clasped tightly around the edges of her blanket. The night was heavy, with the sound of rain hammering against the windows, the wind howling like an unseen predator. A flash of lightning lit up the room, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward her, as if they too wanted to hold her in place. But it wasn't the storm that made her heart race. It was the sound, the faint cry that cut through the chaos outside, barely audible over the thunder. At first, Ella thought it might have been her imagination, perhaps a trick of the storm. But then the sound came again, softer this time, like a cry for help, a sound she couldn't ignore. She had always been the type of girl who noticed the smallest details, the things most people overlooked. A drop of rain on a windowsill, the way her mother's voice trembled when she was worried, or the way the clouds looked just before a storm rolled in. It was this quiet observance that had always made Ella feel different from the other kids at school. She stood up slowly, the floor creaking beneath her bare feet as she moved toward the window. She pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath fogging up the surface as she peered out into the yard. The rain was thick, blurring everything, but through the haze, she saw something. There, near the old oak tree, was a figure, dark and hunched. It didn't belong there, not in the middle of a storm like this. The shape seemed to shift, and for a moment, Ella's heart stopped. Was it a person? Her pulse quickened as another cry echoed through the thunder. It wasn't a human sound. It was deeper, more animalistic, a wounded sound. Without thinking, she turned and rushed toward the door, her small fingers fumbling with the doorknob. "Mom!" she called out, her voice trembling. Her mother, Dana, appeared in the hallway, her brow furrowed in concern. "Ella? What is it?" "There's something out there, Mom. A dog, I think. It's hurt. We have to help it." Dana hesitated, glancing toward the storm outside. The wind howled again, as if protesting Ella's urgency. "Ella, it's dangerous out there. It's just a storm. Whatever it is, it'll be gone by morning." But Ella wasn't convinced. She had never heard a cry like that before. Not from a dog, not from anything. "Please, Mom, we have to check. It's in pain." Dana sighed, rubbing her forehead in that way she always did when she was trying to decide if something was worth the risk. "Fine," she said, finally giving in. "But we go together, and we're not staying out there for long." With a flashlight in hand and Ella's determination leading the way, Dana stepped outside into the pouring rain, the sound of their footsteps lost in the thunder. The yard was dark, the bushes swaying violently in the wind, but Ella's sharp eyes could make out the figure in the distance, moving just a little. As they neared, the faint cry came again, closer now. Dana shined the flashlight toward the shape, and it illuminated the battered form of a dog, collapsed on the ground, its body soaked through, its fur matted with blood and dirt. Oh my God," Dana whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "What happened to you?" Ella knelt beside the dog, ignoring the mud that soaked into her clothes. The dog's fur was the color of old copper, but it was streaked with crimson, and its breathing was shallow, labored. Its eyes, bright, yet filled with something else, something hard to describe, looked up at Ella with a quiet plea for help. Without hesitation, Ella placed her hand gently on the dog's side. "His name is Max," she said softly, the words coming from somewhere deep inside her, as though she had always known. Dana looked at her, eyes wide in surprise, but Ella simply stared back at Max. "We have to help him, Mom," she insisted, her voice steady despite the fear that crept in at the edges. Dana, still in shock, looked down at the dog. She had always been the practical one, the one who weighed the risks and considered the consequences. But there was something in the way Ella's voice quivered with a sense of urgency that moved her. "All right," Dana said, her voice low. "We'll take him inside." Carefully, they lifted Max between them, each of them supporting his weight as they staggered back toward the other door. Max's body was limp in their arms, but his eyes, never left Ella's face. When they reached the warmth of the house, the storm still raged outside. But inside, a new kind of quiet settled over the room. Max was placed on a towel on the living room floor, and Dana rushed to gather supplies. But Ella didn't move. She simply sat beside the injured dog, her eyes never leaving him. The storm continued to roar outside, but Ella felt a strange calm in her chest, as though she had known Max for years, as though this moment, this very night, had been written in the stars, long before the storm had come. The thunder rumbled once more, but now it felt distant, as if it belonged to another world. Ella placed her hand gently on Max's head, and for the first time since the storm had started, she smiled, knowing that whatever came next, she and Max would face it together. The rain fell in sheets, pounding against the roof and windows, but inside, a strange calm had settled. The sound of the storm felt muffled, as if it was a world away. The only thing Ella could hear now was the soft, steady breathing of the German Shepherd lying on the living room floor, his body covered in mud, blood, and dirt. His brown eyes, still wide and watchful, followed her every movement. "Mom, we need to get him cleaned up," Ella said, her voice determined despite the exhaustion settling in her bones. She had only just realized how tired she was. The adrenaline of the discovery had kept her going, but now she was starting to feel the weight of the night. Dana, who had been pacing around the room, taking quick glances at the injured dog, stopped and nodded. "I'll get a towel. You keep an eye on him." Ella did as she was told, sitting on the floor next to Max, her fingers gently brushing the fur on his back. She could feel his ribs, sharp under the skin, and her heart tightened at the thought of how much pain he must have been in. Whoever had done this to him didn't deserve the love Max was offering so freely, even in his broken state. Dana returned with a towel and knelt down next to Max, her face full of concern. "Ella, I don't know if we should be doing this," she said, her voice tight. "What if he's dangerous? What if he bites?" Ella shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "He won't hurt us, Mom. He's just scared. Look at his eyes. He's trusting us. We can't let him down." Dana didn't answer, but she hesitated before gently wiping away the blood on Max's side, the towel coming away stained red. There were cuts and bruises all over his body, but the worst of it seemed to be a deep wound on his leg. It wasn't just a scrape or a gash, it was a wound that spoke of violence, a wound that shouldn't have been there in the first place. "There's something wrong here," Dana murmured. She pressed the towel harder against the wound, her fingers trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding. "This isn't just an accident, Ella. This dog has been hurt on purpose." Ella frowned, her thoughts racing. Something felt off, more than just the storm and the blood. There was an intensity to Max's silence, a kind of quiet strength that made Ella think that there was more to this dog story than met the eye. The way his eyes followed her, unblinking, was almost knowing, like he understood exactly what was happening. As Dana continued to clean the wounds, Ella stood up and wandered toward the front door. She hadn't noticed before, but now that the rain had let up slightly, she could see the faintest marks in the mud that had gathered on the porch, footprints, large ones, as if someone had walked through the yard, dragging something heavy behind them. "Mom," Ella called out, her voice a whisper as she returned to the living room. "There are footprints outside, big ones. They're fresh." Dana glanced at her, brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "What kind of footprints?" "I don't know, but they lead away from the door, like someone was dragging him." Max's ears perked up at the sound of Ella's voice, and his head turned toward the door, his eyes growing more alert. It was as if he understood what she was saying, but couldn't find the strength to move. "Do you think someone left him here?" Ella asked, her voice tinged with horror. Dana shook her head slowly, the reality of the situation sinking in. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I'm starting to think that this wasn't just some stray dog caught in the storm. Ella felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? Dana paused, her eyes narrowing as she considered the situation. I mean, that something doesn't add up. Why would someone leave a dog out in a storm like this, especially one that's been so badly hurt? And why is he so quiet, so still? It's like he's waiting for something or someone. Ella chewed on her bottom lip, glancing at Max. Do you think he's trying to tell us something? Dana didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. We need to take him to a vet. We can't leave him like this. Ella nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. There had to be more to this dog's story. She had felt it the moment she first laid eyes on him. And she was sure of one thing. She wasn't going to let anyone hurt Max again. Underscore, 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 underscore. Later that night, after they had cleaned up as best as they could, Dana made a call to the nearest emergency vet clinic. The drive there was silent, the weight of the evening pressing on them both. Max lay in the back seat, his head resting on Ella's lap as she gently stroked his fur, the only sound the steady hum of the car's engine and the occasional rustle of Max's breath. When they arrived at the clinic, the vet, a stern woman with a no-nonsense attitude, took one look at Max and immediately began preparing for an examination. This poor dog, she muttered as she ran a hand over his body. He's been through hell. Ella felt her heart break at the vet's words. She wanted to ask what exactly had happened to Max, but she knew it wasn't time yet. Not until the vet could help him. After a few tense minutes, the vet scanned Max's neck for a microchip. Ella watched closely as the vet's face grew more serious. There's something here, the vet said, tapping the scanner. It's a chip. Let's see who he belongs to. The name that came up made Ella's blood run cold. Officer Fletcher. The night felt endless. The rain outside had settled into a steady drizzle, but the storm's after effects lingered, both in the weather and in the air inside the house. Ella sat on the couch, her fingers still trembling from the discovery at the vet. Officer Fletcher. The name seemed foreign, yet it held an ominous weight, a mystery Ella couldn't shake. She had hoped that finding a name would provide some answers, but instead, it only deepened the uncertainty. Who was Officer Fletcher, and why had Max been abandoned, left to suffer alone in the storm? Max lay on the living room floor, still struggling to stay awake, his brown eyes heavy with exhaustion and pain. His breathing was shallow, but steady. Dana had done what she could, bandaging his leg, cleaning the wounds. But there was only so much they could do without professional help. The vet had promised to keep Max overnight for observation, but they both knew the worst might be yet to come. Ella, unable to settle, moved toward the floor, where Max lay, her gaze softening when she saw the quiet trust in his eyes. He was so still, so vulnerable in this moment. The way he looked at her now was different than when they first met. At first, his eyes had been filled with fear and confusion, but now there was something else. It was as though he recognized her presence, understood that she would protect him, and that thought made her chest tighten. Max, Ella whispered, kneeling down beside him. You're safe now. I promise. Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed through it. She wasn't just speaking to the dog. She was speaking to herself, too, as if the reassurance would calm the storm inside her own heart. Max's eyes blinked slowly, as though processing her words, but he didn't move. Ella's hand reached out, gently brushing his fur. She could feel the tension in his body, his muscles still tight, still haunted by whatever had happened to him. She knew he wasn't going to heal overnight, but there was something in his stillness that told her he needed more than just physical care. He needed connection. He needed someone to trust. Dana walked into the room, wiping her hands on a towel. Her face was pale, drawn from the emotional toll the night had taken on them both. She'd never been one to get emotional about animals. But something about Max's pain had touched her too. She had always prided herself on being practical, on handling crisis with logic and calmness. But tonight was different. "We should get some sleep," Dana suggested quietly, her eyes glancing from Ella to Max. "It's been a long night." Ella nodded, but she didn't move from her place by Max's side. "I can't sleep," she admitted softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "Not yet." Dana sighed, crossing the room to where Ella was kneeling. "You're exhausted, honey. We all are." "I know," Ella whispered, her eyes never leaving Max. "But he's not just a dog, Mom. He's something more. I can feel it." Dana's expression softened, her protective instinct flaring. "I know you're attached to him, Ella. But we don't know what kind of life he's had before this. We can't just trust him completely yet." Ella didn't respond right away. She simply leaned in closer to Max, her forehead gently resting against his. She could feel the heat of his body, his breath coming in shallow bursts. It was in these quiet moments, when the storm outside was nothing but a distant rumble, that Ella could sense something unspoken between them. But it wasn't just a dog's plea for help. It was a silent communication, a bond that couldn't be explained by words. She understood now. She didn't need to know everything about Max's past to know that he needed her, and that he had chosen her, too. Max's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time since they found him, he shifted slightly, his head moving toward Ella's lap. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Ella's heart swelled. She slowly lowered her hand to his head, her touch gentle, as if afraid to break the fragile moment. She knew Max's journey would be long, and his healing process would take time, both physical and emotional. But she also knew that this was a turning point. This was the moment when Max was beginning to trust her, and she wasn't going to let him down. Dana, standing nearby, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and reluctant admiration. She had seen Ella's quiet strength before, but there was something different tonight. Ella wasn't just trying to help Max out of kindness. She was giving him something deeper. She was offering him her heart, her trust, and a promise. Dana wasn't sure if it was Max who needed the most healing, or if it was Ella. "Maybe we should give him a little space tonight," Dana suggested, her voice tender. "He's been through a lot, and I think you're right. He needs to feel safe. He might not trust easily, but you've already done so much." Ella nodded, but didn't move away. She wasn't ready to leave Max just yet. He had been alone for too long, and now he wasn't alone anymore, at least not in this moment. As the hours stretched on, Dana finally went to bed, leaving Ella sitting with Max in the quiet dark of the living room. The soft tick of the clock on the wall, the occasional rustle of Max's breathing, and the faint hum of the refrigerator were the only sounds that filled the room. Ella stayed by his side, her hand resting lightly on his back, and as the night wore on, she could feel Max's breathing steadying, his body relaxing into the comfort of her presence. He wasn't just a dog lying there. He was a living, breathing soul who had survived something terrible and was now being given a chance to heal. And Ella, with her quiet courage and her open heart, was the one giving him that chance. As she closed her eyes and finally allowed herself to rest, she made a vow, a silent promise that she would stand by Max no matter what secrets the past held or what dangers lay ahead. She would protect him, just as he had already started protecting her in the ways she couldn't yet understand. The morning after Max's first night in the house was quieter than Ella had expected. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a damp and cool air that clung to the windows. Sunlight streamed in through the curtains, but it felt distant, as if the storm from the night before had wiped away everything, leaving only a feeling of uncertainty. Max was still lying on the living room floor, his body slightly stretched out, though his legs trembled slightly when he shifted, Ella had barely slept, her mind still racing with questions about the German Shepherd and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his injuries. The way he'd looked at her last night, his trust, his vulnerability, had created an unspoken promise between them, one she intended to keep. But she still didn't know how to piece together the fragments of Max's past. Dana had spent most of the morning making phone calls, trying to find out more about Officer Fletcher. The vet had called her back just before breakfast, confirming that the dog's chip was indeed registered to the retired police officer, but the information surrounding his death was sparse. According to the local police, Officer Fletcher had been found dead in his home just a few days ago. The cause of death still under investigation. "Mom," Ella said, her voice tentative as she watched Dana pace back and forth. "Do you think do you think he knows what happened to Officer Fletcher?" Dana stopped, turning toward her daughter. "I don't know, honey. It's possible, but we don't have enough information." "Max might be confused. He's been through so much already." Ella nodded, but a feeling gnawed at her. Something wasn't adding up. Max had been left alone in the storm, beaten and abandoned, yet he had held on long enough to find help. Ella knew animals were resilient. But there was something deeper in Max's eyes. She could almost hear him asking for help, not just for his injuries, but for something far darker that he was carrying. Ella moved closer to Max, who now lay curled up, his body stiff and his eyes closed, though he still flinched every now and then. She reached out and gently ran her fingers through his fur. His breathing steadied as she did, and she allowed herself a brief moment of relief, knowing that, at least for now, he wasn't in immediate danger. Dana set the phone down with a sigh, her face pinched in concern. "I called the local police. They confirmed what we already knew. Officer Fletcher's been dead for a few days now. His house was ransacked, but they didn't find anything concrete linking him to what happened to Max." Ella's eyes flickered with curiosity. "What about the other officers? Do they know anything?" "They didn't say much. But there's talk that Fletcher might have been involved in something not entirely above board." Tina paused, glancing at the door. "I don't know what it is, but it's not good. That's why I'm worried, Ella. If Max is connected to Fletcher, we might be in danger too." Ella frowned, her mind racing. What could Max have been involved in? And why hadn't anyone come for him? If he was truly connected to Fletcher, wouldn't someone from the police department be looking for him? Maybe they didn't know he was still alive. Maybe they didn't care. "I don't think Max is dangerous," Ella said softly, her voice full of conviction. "He just needs to remember who he was. He's trying to figure it out." Dana looked at her daughter, clearly torn between wanting to believe her and the practical side of her mind that reminded her of the risks. "I want to believe you, Ella. I do. But we don't know what we're dealing with here. We need to be cautious." Ella didn't reply. She knew her mom was just trying to protect her, but Ella couldn't shake the feeling that Max was trying to tell them something. She had felt it last night when she was sitting by his side, when he had turned to her as if asking for help. But how could she help him when they knew so little about his past? Later that afternoon, they took Max to the vet for a follow-up checkup. He was still limping, though he had gained back a little strength overnight. The vet, Dr. Graham, had been kind and understanding, but when she saw the deep wound on Max's leg, her brow furrowed. "This isn't just a dog that got lost in the storm," she said, her voice heavy with concern. "The kind of injuries he has, they're from something more than just an accident." Dana looked at Dr. Graham with a puzzled expression. What do you mean? Do you think he was attacked?" Dr. Graham hesitated, rubbing her chin thoughtfully. "I don't know for sure, but the nature of these cuts, they look like they were made deliberately. And in this leg," she tapped the leg gently, "it's been damaged before. He's not just recovering from one injury. It's like he's been through this kind of thing before. His body's been through some serious trauma." Ella's heart skipped a beat. "But he's not just an animal in danger, is he?" she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "He's trying to remember something." Dr. Graham's eyes narrowed slightly, and she nodded slowly. "It's possible, Ella. Animals can go through traumatic events that can affect their memory, but it's also possible that Max is a survivor. He's been through something serious, and it's going to take time for him to heal physically and mentally." Ella wasn't sure what to say next, but she knew one thing for sure. Max wasn't just some abandoned dog. He was a survivor. He had been through something terrible, and he wasn't going to give up. And neither would she. On the way home, Ella sat quietly in the back seat, her fingers absent-mindedly scratching Max's ears. The dog's head rested in her lap, his eyes half closed, but even in his exhaustion, he seemed to seek out her presence. Max had been through so much, but as long as he was with her, she wasn't going to let him face it alone. Ella sat in her room, her eyes unfocused as she stared out the window, the dull light of late afternoon streaming across her wet. Max was lying on the living room floor, his breathing steady, though the shadows under his eyes hinted that he wasn't entirely at ease. It had been a week since they had taken him in, and while he had healed physically, something remained unsettling about him. The vet had said it would take time, but Ella knew that it wasn't just the wounds on his body that needed healing. There was something deeper, something unspoken in the way Max watched her, in the way he seemed to withdraw into himself whenever anyone else was near. Ella had always been good at reading people, and animals too, she supposed. Max wasn't just a wounded dog. He was a creature who carried a heavy burden, one that was tied to the shadows of his past. She could feel it in the way his body tensed at sudden movements, the way his eyes flickered with a haunted, distant look whenever he heard a loud noise. It wasn't just fear, it was as though he was remembering something that he couldn't shake. That night, after dinner, Ella sat in the living room with Max, her hand gently resting on his head. The storm from the week before had passed, but the quiet that had settled in the house felt heavier than it had before. And Dana was in the kitchen, cleaning up, her back turned as she hummed softly to herself. Ella, however, couldn't stop thinking about the dreams she had started having the past few nights. They weren't normal dreams. She wasn't sure what they were. Vivid, jumbled fragments of memories that didn't belong to her. But somehow, they felt familiar. And most disturbingly, they were connected to Max. In one dream, she had seen a man, tall, with dark eyes and a weathered face. He had been yelling at Max, shoving him into a small, cold room. The walls were bare, the floors cold concrete. In another dream, she had seen a locked door, one that creaked open just enough to let Max slip through. There was something in the man's hand, something shiny, a weapon, and Max had tried to run, but the man had grabbed him, pulled him back, and Max had howled in pain. Ella jerked awake from one of the dreams, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that they were more than just dreams. They were memories, fragments of something buried in Max's mind, memories he wasn't yet ready to face. She rubbed her eyes and stood up, walking toward the living room. Max lay on the rug, his head resting on his paws, his eyes closed. She sat beside him, her heart racing as the images from her dreams flashed in her mind. She couldn't explain it. She wasn't sure if Max was somehow trying to communicate these memories to her, or if it was just her imagination running wild. But the connection she felt to him was undeniable. She had to know more. Max, Ella whispered, her fingers brushing through his fur. What happened to you? What are you trying to tell me? Max stirred slightly at the sound of her voice, lifting his head to look at her with those knowing eyes. For a moment, they just stared at each other, a silence stretching between them that felt as old as time itself. Ella's breath caught in her throat. The look in his eyes wasn't just that of a frightened animal. It was the look of someone who had been through something so terrible, so unimaginable, that words could never describe it. It was as if Max was asking for her help, not just for his physical wounds, but for the darkness that lived within him. Suddenly, a sharp, unexplainable thought flashed through Ella's mind. It was a memory, but not her own. She saw the man again, the one from her dream, and this time, he wasn't yelling at Max. He was holding something heavy, something dark, and then she saw a basement. The cold concrete floor, the smell of mildew. Max was there, pacing, his eyes wide with fear. The man was saying something, but the words were lost to Ella, muffled in a way that felt intentional. She gasped, her heart racing. She could see it so clearly. Max cowering in the corner of a dark room, the door locked tight, his only company the cold silence that filled the space. "Mom!" Ella called, her voice cracking with urgency. "Mom, you have to listen to me. I know what happened to Max." Dana rushed into the room, her expression concerned. "What is it, Ella?" Ella stood up quickly, her body trembling from the intensity of the vision that had just overwhelmed her. She could feel the images still burning in her mind, like flashes of lightning in a dark sky. "He's been in a basement, Mom. A dark, cold room. And there was a man there. He was hurting Max. I don't know how, but I think Max is remembering it." Dana's face grew pale, and she glanced at Max, who was now sitting up, his head cocked slightly as he listened to Ella's frantic words. "You're not making sense, Ella," Dana said, though her voice lacked the usual confidence. I know you want to help Max, but..." "No, Mom. This isn't just a guess. I saw it. I saw what happened to him." Ella's voice broke, but she didn't care. She had to make her mother believe her. "The man was... he was hurting him. I saw it. Max can't remember everything yet, but I think he's trying to tell me. I know it." Dana took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "Ella, I know this is difficult, but dreams don't always tell us the truth. What you're describing sounds like a nightmare, not something real." Ella shook her head, her heart pounding. "It's not just a nightmare, Mom. It's real. I know it is." Dana looked down at Max, who was now watching them both. With his head lowered, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness, she sighed, her fingers running through her hair. "I don't know, Ella. I don't know what's real anymore." Ella's gaze locked onto Max, her heart aching. She knew, deep down, that Max wasn't just a dog in need of help. He was a survivor, and the memories of his past were locked away, memories that were coming back, piece by piece, trying to find their way to the surface. The question now was, could Ella unlock them before it was too late? The days that followed were filled with an unsettling quiet. Ella couldn't shake the images from her dreams, the fractured memories that seemed to belong to Max but were tangled up in her own mind. Her connection with him had deepened over the past week, and though Max's body was healing, there was still a distance between them, a space that neither of them knew how to bridge. He was still haunted, and though he had started to trust her, the shadows of his past seemed to weigh heavily on him. Ella couldn't let it go. She couldn't just wait for Max to piece the memories together on his own. She needed to understand what had happened to him, what he had been through, and more importantly, she needed to make sure he was safe. Dana, though concerned, had been trying to reach out to the authorities about Officer Fletcher. But so far, there had been little progress. The police had barely given them any information, and Dana's growing unease only seemed to mirror Ella's own. They had no answers, and the quiet stillness in their home felt like a ticking clock, one that threatened to tick louder with every passing day. It was a Friday evening when things finally started to break open. Ella had spent most of the afternoon working on her homework, her mind distracted as she thought about Max. She could hear him pacing in the living room, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors. His restlessness mirrored her own, and she couldn't focus. Her hand instinctively reached for her tablet, and she began searching for any information about Officer Fletcher's death. Something, anything, might offer a clue. She had been scrolling for only a few minutes when a new headline caught her eye. Hawaii. Retired officer's death, possibly linked to criminal network. Investigation ongoing. Her heart skipped a beat. She clicked on the link, her fingers trembling as she read the article. The words blurred as her mind raced, but one sentence stood out. Authorities suspect Fletcher was involved in a criminal syndicate known for illegal weapons and animal trafficking. Ella felt a chill crawl up her spine. It wasn't just Max's injuries that made sense now. It was everything. Officer Fletcher wasn't just some retired cop with a quiet life. He was a part of something far darker. And if Max had been involved with him, then he wasn't just a victim. He was tied to a much larger web. "Mom!" Ella called out, her voice tight with urgency. "You need to see this." Dana appeared in the doorway, her expression weary but attentive. Ella pushed the tablet toward her, and Dana's eyes scanned the article. As she read, her face paled. "This is," Dana whispered, her voice trailing off. "This is what I was afraid of. Max wasn't just abandoned. He was part of something much bigger." Ella's chest tightened. "I knew it. I knew he wasn't just a dog. He's trying to remember what happened, what he was a part of. And he's trying to tell us." Dana sat down beside her, her fingers rubbing her temples as she absorbed the information. "But what does it mean for Max? For us?" Ella didn't have an answer. All she knew was that something wasn't right. Max had been through hell, but now it seemed as though the past was catching up with him, and catching up with them. "Max deserves to know what happened to him," Ella said, her voice firm. "We need to help him. He can't be the only one left in the dark." Dana stared at Max, who was now sitting by the doorway, his eyes fixed on them both, his body still but tense. She could see the unease in him, the way his body subtly flinched every time the conversation turned toward the past. "We'll get through this, Ella," Dana said quietly, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We will. But we need to be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with." Ella nodded, but she didn't feel reassured. The more she learned, the more she realized how little they truly knew, and the more she felt the weight of the responsibility to protect Max, to uncover the secrets that had been buried for so long. That night, as the sky darkened and the house grew quieter, Ella couldn't sleep. Her mind wouldn't stop. She kept thinking about Max, about the man in her dreams, about the locked basement, about the cruel actions that had shaped Max's life. There was a dark pull in her chest, a need to understand, to piece together the puzzle that was Max's past. And then, just as she was about to close her eyes, something shifted in the room. Max had been lying quietly on the floor, but now he was standing, his ears alert, his head tilted as though he had heard something in the distance. His body was tense, his muscles coiled like a spring. "Max?" Ella whispered, sitting up quickly. Max didn't respond. He was staring at the window, his eyes focused on something just beyond the glass. Ella's heart raced. She followed his gaze, but the darkness outside revealed nothing. The house felt too still. And then she heard it too. A faint sound, something that didn't belong. A car engine, distant but growing closer. A sudden tension filled the air as Ella stood up. She moved quietly toward the window, her breath shallow, every instinct on high alert. She couldn't explain why she felt so certain, but she knew. Whoever was outside, they weren't here for Max by accident. Her heart hammered in her chest as she turned to her mother. "Mom, someone's here." Dana's eyes went wide, her protective instinct kicking in as she quickly moved toward the door. "Stay behind me, Ella. We don't know who's out there." But Ella wasn't going to wait. She wasn't going to let anyone take Max again. Ella's heart raced as she stood by the window, her eyes locked on the shadowy figure outside. Max, who had been resting quietly on the floor just moments before, now stood by her side. His body tense, his ears perked up as he sniffed the air, sensing the danger that was approaching. The quiet, creeping fear that had been building inside her ever since Max had come into their lives was now taking form. Whoever was out there wasn't here by chance. They were here for something, and Ella was certain, and it had to do with Max. "Mom," Ella whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "We need to hide." "They're here for Max." Dana, who had been moving toward the door to check on the disturbance outside, froze. Her eyes narrowed, her instinct kicking in as she turned to her daughter. "Stay low, Ella. Don't move until I say so." Ella's mind was racing, but she couldn't ignore the urgency in her mother's voice. Dana wasn't just trying to protect them from some random intruder. She knew something was wrong, something more than just a simple break-in. Max," Ella said softly, her voice shaking with both fear and resolve. The dog's eyes locked onto hers, and he gave a low growl, his body still tense, as though he was preparing for something. It was as if Max knew what was coming. Dana quickly grabbed Ella's arm, pulling her away from the window and toward the back of the house. "We need to get to the basement now." The house, which had felt so safe just days ago, now seemed too quiet, too vulnerable. The sounds of the car engine had stopped, but something about the silence made Ella's stomach twist. She could hear her own breath, ragged and uneven. As they hurried through the house, Max followed them, his movements quiet but deliberate, as though he was watching every corner of the house for signs of movement. They reached the basement door, but Dana hesitated. She glanced at the locked door behind her, her hand shaking as she turned the knob. She wasn't sure what to expect on the other side. It was late, and the house had been settled in for the night. But now, the thought of hiding in the dark, alone with her daughter and Max, made her second-guess everything. The fear in Ella's eyes told her that their lives were about to change forever. "Get in," Dana said firmly, her voice low, her expression determined. "Now." Ella didn't argue. She moved toward the basement door, her pulse racing, her body heavy with adrenaline. The basement was cold and dark, the familiar scent of mildew hanging in the air. It was a place they'd only used for storage, but now it felt like the only refuge they had left. Max, ever the protector, stayed close to Ella's side as they descended the stairs. The old wood creaked beneath their feet, and for a moment, Ella thought she heard footsteps following them, but when she turned around, nothing was there. The fear in her chest made her ears ring, blocking out everything but the desperate need to protect Max. Dana closed the door behind them and hurried to turn on a light. The low hum of the light bulb flickered before settling into a dim glow. "We need to stay quiet," Dana whispered. "Do you understand, Ella?" Ella nodded, though her heart felt like it was pounding in her throat. She wanted to say something, anything, to reassure her mother, but the words wouldn't come. She felt paralyzed by fear, by the weight of everything that had been happening. Her thoughts turned to Max, and she glanced at him. He was lying on the floor, his eyes wide, his gaze fixed on the door, his muscles tensed. "Mom," Ella whispered, her voice trembling. "What if they find us?" Dana didn't answer immediately. She sat down beside Ella, wrapping an arm around her. "We won't let that happen," she said firmly. "But we have to stay calm. We need to wait this out, see what they want. They're not getting through that door unless we let them." But Ella wasn't so sure. The way Max had reacted to the sound outside told her that whoever was out there wasn't just a random threat. They were someone who had a deep connection to Max, someone who knew exactly who he was, and worse, someone who might know where they were hiding. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the silence pressing against them, suffocating. The only sounds in the basement were their quiet breaths and the occasional rustling of Max shifting on the floor. The tension in the air was thick, almost palpable. The thought of being trapped, of not knowing who was after them or why, gnawed at Ella's mind. Then, as if in answer to her fears, a loud bang echoed from upstairs. The door to the house was being forced open. Max's head shot up, and he let out a low growl, his body tensing. Ella's heart skipped a beat as the sound of boots on the floor grew louder, drawing nearer. Whoever was coming wasn't being quiet. They weren't trying to sneak into the house. They were coming for something. Or someone. "Stay down," Dana ordered, her voice low but full of authority. She reached for the small phone in her pocket, dialing the police. The sound of heavy footsteps grew louder, reaching the foot of the stairs. Ella's breath hitched in her throat, and she could feel Max's body grow rigid beside her. There was no mistaking it now. Whoever was here. They knew Max was in the house. They had to. Dana clutched the phone tightly in her hand, her fingers shaking as she held it to her ear. "Come on," she muttered, under her breath. "Please, hurry." The door to the basement rattled suddenly, and Ella's heart stopped. The basement was still. Too still. Ella could hear the soft sound of her own breathing, her heart hammering in her chest. The door rattled again, and she stiffened, her fingers tightening around Max's fur. He sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the door, his body rigid, ready for whatever was about to come. The thud of footsteps upstairs was getting closer, but there was no sound of anyone calling out or speaking, just the creak of floorboards and the unmistakable presence of someone searching. Someone who knew exactly what they were after. "Mom," Ella whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if they find us? What if they find Max?" Dana's hand, shaking slightly, gripped her daughter's shoulder. "We just need to stay quiet," she whispered back. "And we wait for the police. They'll get here." Ella nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed against her chest like an unrelenting hand. She didn't know if they'd make it in time. Max wasn't just some random dog. They were coming for him. Whoever these people were, they knew what he had been through, and they weren't about to let him slip through their fingers again. The basement door rattled once more, louder this time, as though whoever was on the other side was trying to force it open. Ella held her breath, and in that silence she could hear the sound of her pulse pounding in her ears. It felt like hours had passed, though it had only been minutes since Dana had made the call. Max growled low in his throat, his hackles raised. Ella's heart leapt in her chest. This was real. This was happening. Max wasn't just afraid. He was prepared to fight. His protective instinct had kicked in, and it was as though he knew they were in danger. He was still injured, still recovering, but he was ready to protect her, to protect them all. And then, as quickly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. The basement door had been left untouched. Dana's breath came in shallow gasps as she looked at Ella, her face pale but resolute. Ella glanced at Max, whose eyes never left the door. He was still, but his body was coiled tight, like a spring ready to snap. Then, without warning, the sound of a car engine broke the silence, distant at first, but growing louder. The tension in the room was unbearable. Dana's hand tightened on Ella's shoulder, her lips pressed together, in a thin line. They both listened, waiting, listening for any sound, any sign that someone had found them. But after a few long moments, the sound of the engine began to fade. Whoever had come for them was leaving. Ella let out a long, shaky breath, and she slowly turned to her mother. "Do you think they've gone?" "I don't know," Dana replied, her voice strained. "I don't know who they were. But we can't take any chances." As the car engine faded, the house grew quiet again. Max, still alert, began to relax, his body slowly lowering to the floor as he curled up in a ball. The protective stance he had taken seemed to melt away with the passing danger. Ella reached out to stroke his fur, and this time he leaned into her touch, his muscles no longer stiff, his eyes calm. "Good boy," Ella whispered, her voice breaking as she let out a breath she didn't even realize she'd been holding. Max's head turned toward her, his eyes softening as he accepted her comfort. Despite the fear and pain that still clung to him, he had trusted her. He had stood beside her, ready to protect her just as she had promised to protect him. Dana moved cautiously toward the basement stairs and listened carefully. She waited a beat, straining to hear any sounds. When nothing came, she gave a soft nod. I think it's safe to come out now. Ella hesitated for a moment, her eyes still locked on Max. She had seen how far he had come in the short time he'd been with them. The dog, who had once been lost and broken, too scared to trust anyone, was now sitting by her side, a protector in his own right. But it wasn't just Max who was healing, it was Ella too. She was learning how to be brave, how to stand up against the unknown, how to fight for those she loved. "Are you okay?" Dana asked softly, her voice breaking Ella's reverie. Ella turned to her mother and nodded. "I'm okay," she said quietly. We're okay." They slowly made their way back upstairs with Max following behind them, his body still moving with care. The house felt different now. Empty, as though the space had been drained of all warmth and life. The reality of what had just happened hung heavily in the air. The danger wasn't over yet. Max's past was still a mystery, and Ella knew that there was much more to the story than they had uncovered so far. But for now, Max was safe. He was with them, and that was enough. They sat in the living room, the silence in the house oppressive, but not as suffocating as it had been just moments before. Dana spoke first, her voice quiet, but filled with a sense of resolve. "We'll call the police again in the morning. But for now, we have to focus on Max. He needs to heal." Ella nodded, her eyes never leaving the dog. "He's been through so much, but we'll help him. We'll figure out what happened." Max lay at their feet, his eyes closed, though his ears flicked slightly at the sound of their voices. He was listening. He was still there with them, and that was the most important thing. Max had survived. He had made it through the worst of it, and he wasn't going to be alone anymore. Not as long as Ella was there, and for the first time in days, Ella allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. She had always been the one to take care of others. But now she realized she wasn't just helping Max. Max had changed her. He had given her the strength to face the darkness that had been following them. Together, they would face whatever came next. The weeks that followed were a slow but steady march toward recovery, not just for Max, but for Ella as well. The storm had passed, both literally and metaphorically. Max, though still carrying the weight of his past, was gradually shedding the shadows that had clung to him. His limp had lessened with each passing day, and his once guarded eyes had softened, learning to trust the people who had opened their home to him. His wounds had healed, though there were scars that would never fade, both on his body and in his soul. Ella watched Max closely as he lay by her side on the couch, his head resting on her lap as she absent-mindedly stroked his fur. There was a peacefulness in the way he relaxed now, something that had been absent when they first met. She could feel the transformation within him, but she could also feel it within herself. The fear that had once consumed her, the uncertainty of the world around her, was now replaced with something else, something stronger, a quiet resilience. She had always been a caretaker, always the one to protect others. But now, as she sat with Max, she realized that he had taught her something she hadn't even known she needed to learn. That healing wasn't just about mending broken parts. It was about giving someone or something the space to find its own strength. Max's eyes fluttered open, and he lifted his head slightly, his gaze meeting Ella's. She smiled down at him, her heart swelling with pride and affection. He was more than just a dog to her now, and he was a partner, a companion. He had shared his past with her, not in words, but in the way he trusted her with every step of his recovery. And Ella, in turn, had shared her own fears, her own struggles, and through it all, Max had been her silent strength. It was the small things, Max's steady presence beside her as she studied, the way he would nudge her hand with his nose when she felt overwhelmed. It was in the moments when she needed comfort most, and Max, without hesitation, would climb into her lap, his head resting against her chest, offering warmth and quiet companionship. Ella hadn't realized just how much she needed that kind of connection until it had been given to her. Max was no longer the broken, fearful dog they had taken in that stormy night. He was now a symbol of survival, of strength, and perhaps even redemption. But it wasn't just his recovery that amazed Ella. It was what he had begun to give back. The first time Ella realized the full extent of Max's potential to heal or others was when they took him to visit the children's hospital. An idea Dana had suggested one evening after they had talked about their experience with Max. The thought had seemed like a simple gesture at first, just a way to give back, to allow others to experience the calm and comfort Max had given them. But what happened in the hospital room that day was something Ella hadn't expected. They entered the pediatric ward, Max walking beside her, his body relaxed but his eyes alert, as always. The children in the ward were mostly bedridden, many with IVs or other medical devices attached to them. There was an air of quiet despair in the room, an undercurrent of pain and uncertainty that Ella could feel the moment they walked in. The nurses welcomed them with warm smiles, knowing they had brought Max in for a reason. Ella gently guided Max toward the nearest child, a young boy named Ben, who was sitting up in bed, his face pale, but his eyes curious. Ben was about 8 years old, his small frame wrapped in a blanket, and he looked at Max with a mix of apprehension and hope. "Would you like to meet Max?" Ella asked softly, her voice kind but gentle. Ben's eyes lit up, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Can I pet him?" Ella nodded and gently guided Max closer to Ben's bed. Max hesitated for a moment, his instincts cautious, but then, as if sensing the boy's need, he carefully walked over and sat at the foot of the bed. Ben's small hand reached out, and for the first time since Ella had met him, Max allowed himself to be close to someone else without retreating. Ben's fingers lightly brushed through Max's fur, and a quiet transformation took place before Ella's eyes. Ben's expression softened, his breathing calming as he ran his hand through Max's coat. The room, once heavy with the weight of illness and sorrow, seemed to lift with a subtle warmth. It wasn't magic. It was simply the power of connection, of understanding. And in that moment, Max was more than just a survivor. He was healer. The nurses stood in the background, watching the interaction with quiet admiration. Ella glanced at her mother, who stood by the door, her eyes filled with silent gratitude and awe. "See?" Dana whispered, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "He's doing it. He's healing others." Ella nodded, her heart swelling with pride. She had never imagined that Max could be more than just a companion to her. But as she watched the young boy's face light up, his fear melting away with every gentle nudge from Max, Ella understood that Max was doing something extraordinary. He was offering what he had been given. The quiet gift of love and healing. Over the next few weeks, Max became a regular visitor to the hospital. Each time they brought him, more children lined up to meet him, to feel his warmth, his calm energy. It wasn't just the children who benefited from Max's presence. It was everyone around him. The nurses, the parents, the visitors. They all found solace in his quiet company. Ella noticed it too. The way Max's presence seemed to fill the room, the way people's shoulders relaxed. Their smiles returned as if they were all being reminded of something simple yet profound, that healing didn't just happen in a hospital room, it happened in the heart. Ella knew that Max had changed her life, but she hadn't realized the full extent of how he would change the lives of so many others. His past had been filled with pain and fear, but now he was a symbol of survival, of overcoming darkness, and of bringing light into the lives of others. And as they left the hospital that day, Max walked beside Ella with the quiet confidence of a dog who had found his purpose. "Thank you, Max," Ella whispered, her voice full of emotion. "You've made me believe in something bigger than myself." Max, ever the quiet hero, looked up at her with his deep brown eyes. And for the first time, Ella knew that they would be okay, that together they could face whatever the world threw their way. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the park as Ella and Max walked side by side. The sound of Max's paws on the gravel path was the only noise that broke the stillness of the evening. The park was quiet. Peaceful? The world outside seemed to have slowed down just for them. The trees, heavy with the colors of autumn, swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves falling softly to the ground in a swirl of gold and red. Ella smiled as she looked down at Max, his fur glowing in the last light of the day. The dog, who had once been a broken, abandoned soul, was now standing tall, walking beside her with the quiet confidence of a survivor. He no longer limped, his movements smooth and sure. The emotional scars of his past remained, but they no longer defined him. They had shaped him, yes, but Max had found a way to move forward, to heal, and to trust again. And Ella had healed too. She had learned from Max about resilience, about the strength it takes to move past pain, and about the quiet power of love and connection. She had found a new sense of courage in herself, a courage that came not from avoiding fear, but from facing it head-on, knowing that with the right people and the right dog by her side, she could handle anything. Look at us, Max, Ella said, her voice soft but filled with a quiet joy. We've come so far. Max, as if understanding every word, turned his head toward her. His deep brown eyes met hers, and for a moment everything else faded. The world around them, familiar yet full of possibility, seemed to stretch out before them. There was no more uncertainty, no more fear. There was just the road ahead, the two of them, and the promise of what could come. Ella had learned something from Max. She had learned that healing wasn't linear. It wasn't something that could be fixed all at once. Healing took time, and sometimes it meant facing your darkest moments head-on, walking through them until you could come out on the other side stronger. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. And Max, in his own quiet way, had shown her how to do that. As they continued their walk, the park grew emptier. The evening slipping into night, the city's distant hum faded, replaced by the sound of wind rustling through the trees. Ella couldn't help but think back to the beginning. The storm, the night they had found Max, the fear, the uncertainty, the broken pieces of a dog who had been left to suffer alone. She could remember the heaviness in her chest, the feeling of being lost in the midst of a world that seemed too big to understand. But now, standing beside Max, she understood. She understood that the pieces of their lives, the fragments of pain, the fears that held them back, were not meant to be buried. They were meant to be embraced, acknowledged, and used as a foundation to build something better. Max had helped her see that. As they reached the park's entrance, Ella stopped, her fingers gently resting on Max's head. "We've made it, haven't we, boy?" she whispered. Max's eyes softened, and he gave a small nudge of his nose against her hand, his body leaning into her touch as though saying, "Yes, we have." Ella chuckled softly, her heart full. And then, as the last light of the day dipped below the horizon, Ella realized something that made her heart swell with pride. She had always thought she was the one helping Max. But in reality, he had been unhelping her all along. Together, they had healed. Together, they had learned what it meant to fight for each other, to trust, to move forward, and to never give up. Max wasn't just the dog who had come into her life on a stormy night. He was the dog who had saved her, too. She thought about everything they had been through, the dangers, the fear, the uncertainty. It had been a long journey, and it hadn't been easy. But now, standing here with Max by her side, Ella knew that she was stronger than she had ever been before. Max had taught her that strength didn't always come from fighting battles. It came from having the courage to keep going, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As she walked back toward the car, Max trotting beside her, Ella felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She knew their journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments of fear and doubt. But with Max beside her, she knew they could face anything. They were no longer just survivors of their pasts. They were healers, of each other, and of anyone who needed them. Before Ella opened the car door, she turned to Max, crouching down to his level. "You're my best friend, you know that?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so lucky to have you." Max, as if understanding every word, leaned in close, his head resting against her chest. And for a long moment, they simply stood there, two souls who had found each other when they needed it most. The world was quiet, and in that stillness, there was only love, the love they had found in each other. And with that love, there was nothing they couldn't face. Even the most broken can protect, love, and heal, Ella whispered. The words a promise she knew they would keep. All they need is someone brave enough to believe in them. Max gave one last gentle nudge with his nose, and together they walked forward into the unknown, knowing that whatever came next, they were ready.